Statistics Canada will release new numbers on inflation this week, but Canadians who've had to buy gas, groceries, pretty much anything recently already know costs are rising. In fact, the last set of data showed inflation at a 31-year high. That was back in April. The finance minister gave a speech on Thursday outlining what the government is doing to help people facing higher prices. I spoke with Canada's Parliamentary budget officer about that plan and the challenge of tackling those rising costs. Mr. Giroux, nice to see you.
Likewise, thank you.
So the measures that Minister of Finance, Minister Freeland, announced on Thursday were largely measures that were put in place before inflation got to the level that it's at now. They were put in place during the budget. And I wonder whether you think there should have been broader support or a bigger package to reflect the current rate of inflation and the bit of crisis that we are in from that point of view.
Well, that's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm not in the business of giving advice to government when it comes to instituting or putting in place new policies or altering existing policies. What I can say, though, is that inflation in Canada is caused by a couple of interesting factors, some that are domestic, others that are foreign. For example, there's significant disruptions in the supply chain, and that is causing inflation. There's also demand that is significantly higher, especially with respect to goods, and that is putting pressure on prices. Anybody who's tried to buy a new car or even a used car recently knows what I'm talking about. So it's not there's no one solution that will alleviate inflation. It's a multiple sources phenomenon. And it won't be alleviated or addressed pretty quickly with a magic wand.
Okay, so let me ask you about some of the measures that the government has said are important for coping with inflation. They're tied to inflation support programs, the OAS, the Old Age Security Benefit, the Canada Child Benefit. Those are things that people get support through the year. They are tied to inflation, and so they would increase a little bit. Are they increased enough where you would say that those policy choices are making a difference for those targeted populations and communities?
Well, the thing with these government programs is that they're already indexed. Yeah. However, there is a lag between the indexation and when the price increases hit recipients of these programs, such as OAS and the Guaranteed Income Supplement for low-income individuals. So it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but they are benefiting with a lag from indexation. So they will have some compensation from inflation. But the decision by government and that multiple levels of government have to make is whether or not to compensate these households in advance or as the inflation is hitting their disposable income. Right. And that is always a conundrum. Do you support these individuals and households with one-off checks like we have seen in Quebec and like the federal government has promised to do with old age security? Or do you just let these programs, indexation, work its way through the system with a certain lag? And that is always a very difficult conundrum because when governments are supporting households, low-income households, they're not doing anything to lower inflation. They're just trying to mitigate the impact on some households of rising inflation. So it's not doing anything per se to lower the inflation rate. It's just a remediation measure to alleviate the negative impacts.
And I guess it would make a difference, too, if those benefits are given on a monthly basis versus a quarterly basis in terms of how much you are helped in the immediate.
Indeed, and with the old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, to name these, they're provided on a monthly basis, but they're also indexed on a quarterly basis. Okay. But there is a lag, as we discussed a few seconds ago. So inflation is not reflected immediately in increased benefits for the recipients, for seniors who are receiving OAS-GIS.
You talked about some other jurisdictions where they have made decisions to send sort of one-off checks or do one-off things to sort of help alleviate the pain. The other, I would say, challenge, though, with that, and I'd like your thoughts on that, is making sure that that doesn't then inflame inflation further, that it doesn't heat up inflation. How do you thread that needle? Because that seems very challenging.
Well, that's indeed a very good question, because if you provide assistance to individuals, so you inject money in the economy, that increases the purchasing power of individuals, and it can, if it's done on a wide scale, fuel inflation. But when you're talking about a few $100s for low-income households or individuals, I don't think we're fanning the flames of inflation. There are other measures that could do that, that would do that,
Yeah.
especially when we are just coming out of a pandemic where the government ran deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars. When we're talking about a few $1 billion to help the poorest individuals, we're not talking about an inflationary pressure that will have a noticeable impact.
Okay. There was an initial thought when inflation started rising that it would be transitory. I think we've all sort of put that aside now. There's a realization that it is not. But do you have a sense of how long it could last? How difficult is and painful this might be going forward for Canadians?
Well, it's always transitory. It depends how you define the transition period.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to determine how long this inflation period will last. It will depend on a number of factors, notably what happens in Ukraine, what happens on the oil markets, also what happens with interest rates, because central banks around the world have been increasing interest rates, which will have an impact on inflation. But the big question is whether that will be sufficient or whether more will be needed. All economists, or a majority of economists, believe that more interest rate increases will be necessary to tame inflation. But the delicate balance for central bankers is doing that while avoiding pushing countries into a recession. And there's also the housing market that is pretty fragile after the price increases we have seen over the last couple of years. So rising interest rates abruptly could trigger something that would be undesirable, such as significant price decreases. So it's a very challenging task that central banks have around the world, especially in Canada.
So, and you mentioned recession there. There does seem to be growing concern about a recession, particularly in the United States. That seems to be where the concern is focused right now. I wonder what your views are on whether we are headed towards one. I mean, I don't think anyone would think it would be the same as 2008, but perhaps a smaller, shorter version of that. What are your views?
Well, again, it's difficult to assess because of the high level of uncertainty and whether central banks will continue to increase interest rates, and at what pace. That will be a determining factor, as well as how the housing market responds. But if we were to enter into a recession, there are no signs for now that it would be a deep recession, one that would have devastating effects. It would probably, for what we see now, something that would be more akin to a pause in economic growth rather than a deep recession that would have very negative impacts, especially in the labor market, because the labor market is running close to or at capacity. So even if there's a recession, if there were to be a recession in the next couple of months, it would not, as things stand now, being a devastating one.
Okay. Monsieur Giroux, always nice to speak with you. I appreciate you sharing your smarts. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you.